Hello and welcome back to BOSH tutorial video session series. This is Jamil again. In this section, we're gonna continue talking about bootstrapping a BOSH director VM, as that will be the second video. In the first video, as you remember, we went through the tutorial on BOSH IO, and then we created the actual BOSH VM on VirtualBox locally, and we were able to communicate with it. But we didn't go into the details of what really happened whenever we did that. So this section will be to talk about that. So the agenda for this video will be first to talk about the BOSH create-env dependencies, which we missed from the last video. We're going to talk also about the operations files, the BOSH operations files, and we're going to also talk about BOSH interpolate command and what does it mean. So let's go and start with the BOSH create-env dependency. Sorry, I missed it the last time. So if you want to create a BOSH, if you want to use BOSH create-env, you need to have certain dependencies on your machine. So if you go to the BOSH docs, and then if you go to CLI, you can see there's a create-env dependencies, and you can see for each operating system, you need to install a few software. Just make sure that you have them, and that should be fine. So with that out of the way, let's go and see. Let's start. So if we remember from last time, we ran this command, the BOSH create-env command, which has many options, many inputs, and it magically went ahead and created the BOSH director VM for us. But what does this actual command does? What are those options? Let's start first with this highlighted section, which is the bosh.yaml. So we are giving BOSH create VM one input, which is the bosh.yaml. Let's see what is it. And you can see here is, if you remember, we were using the BOSH deployment repo where we cloned it locally, and this was our base to create the BOSH director. So here there should be a bosh.yaml. I'm going to use the GitHub because it's easier to navigate. So let's go to bosh.yaml, and you can see it's just a YAML file with some options in it, with some configurations. We will not go into what each one of them mean because it will complicate things at this stage of learning BOSH. So you can see there's a big YAML file. Cool. Now we're gonna skip the state.json, the state flag, till end of this session, and we're gonna talk about those -o. Every time you see the -o, that's an alias for the dash operation file. What does that mean is, we talked about it a bit before, but think about those highlighted files, the ones that we are giving, the YAML files that we are giving the command with the -o options as sections of YAML that we are injecting in this base file. So this is our base configuration, and then we are injecting specific configurations into this base YAML file. So for example, because we are using the VirtualBox CPI, we're going to inject this YAML file here, and etc. So what's going to happen is the BOSH create VM command, the first thing it's going to do is going to take the base file, then it's going to read the first operation file, it's going to inject it in this. The result, we will put it in our hand, and then we're going to just take this operation file and then inject it into the result of the above two, and we're going to do the same thing until we get here where we add this Jambox user ops file to the result of all of the above. So let's actually take a look at those files, the ops files. How do they look like? So if we go here back and we go to the BOSH deployment, and let's go to the VirtualBox, and it was the cpi.yaml. You can see it's also a YAML file, but it's in a very particular structure. We call each section of those, so this one or the one below it, it's an operation. So we are doing an operation on the base file. To take an example, what does that mean is, so we take, imagine that the base file is a tree because it's YAML like JSON, and the path, which is /releases, we are going to inject this value inside that section. So the releases will be an array, so we're going to inject this value as a item in this array. Don't worry too much about the practicality of how does that work, but it's worth to mention that the mechanism this work is using this library. This one is written by the product manager of BOSH, and it's based. It says it's roughly based on JSON patch. If you want to have a look, and there's some usage example of how to patch a YAML file to add certain commits. And I'm gonna skip this version. So what's gonna happen is you can just go through it and see all the options. But the gist of it, for us, what we care about for now is there's some values that we're gonna inject inside the base YAML file in specific paths. Let's say this one is in this path. What we're gonna also now, actually it's also worth to mention why do we have it this way, is this is a nice way of separating the configurations. So we know that this is the base file that will work with all the IaaSes, but let's say if we're gonna use VirtualBox, there's some options that are only for VirtualBox, so we're gonna inject them into the base file. And let's say if we're using AWS, there will be some AWS CPI configuration that are only applicable for that, so we're gonna inject here. So rather than replicating everything, this is a way of making things simpler. So those are the operations files. I'm gonna also skip this var store for now and the creds.yaml. So till now we have skipped the state.json and this one. We're gonna come back to it later. And let's actually now go through this -v. -v means that you are providing a variable to your create-env command. So what does that mean is, let's go back to the, let's say to the base file, which is the bosh.yaml. You can see here there's this syntax where you have double parentheses and you have, let's say, internal IP. What's going to happen is whenever you provide a variable here, this internal IP, and you give it a value, BOSH CLI, the BOSH create-env, it's going to take that value, which is 192.168.50.6, and it's going to replace it here. And the same thing for all the other ones. So for these ones and these ones, so you need to provide it as well. So all those. So those are variables that are user provided. You will add it using the -v command. Now from here we're gonna go and touch base on the generation of variables that are not user provided. Something like, let's check, for example, let's go with this guy, this one. So we see that there's a password, the password of the user, the one that we logged in as. It's also a variable, but we never provided ourselves. And if you remember from previous video, we logged into the director without even creating a password ourselves. We used a password, it was created somehow. So this password is this value. But who generate this value? It will be the CLI. The CLI, the create-env command, will generate this value. And how the way it does it is, inside the YAML file, the one that you provide, there's a variable section, and you list all your variables, and you say this is, let's say, the admin password. The admin password is a password, so the CLI knows that this type password can be generated somehow. It will generate it, and it will replace the value of this admin password inside this one, etc. So it's going to generate all of these, let's say the health monitor password here, or Postgres password. And it's not only passwords, you can also generate certificates, and you can have options to the certificates, and then you can tell it which certificate signed which CA it has. This is a very practical way of generating those credentials, because you don't want to do this by hand because it's error prone and it becomes very tedious with time. So this way you can specify your variables, specify the type, and just reference them in your manifest. So now the question is, the values that are generated, like where do they reside? Do they vanish? They will not. They will end up in this creds.yaml file. So this is the var store command. var store option. We will mention what is the YAML file, the path where we're gonna store those generated values. And you can see here it's creds.yaml, and there's already creds.yaml that was generated from our previous create-env command. So you can see here that it's also a YAML file, and it will say, let's say this is the admin password, it has this value, etc. You can see all the way, you don't really need to go through it by hand. The values you can extract them in a way that we'll learn about it later. So one question that comes to mind, maybe somebody would ask, like, is it safe to keep those creds.yaml just laying on the file system like that? That's debatable, and there's one option that is being currently developed, or probably I think it's already done. It will allow that those creds.yaml, the contents, to be saved in a credential storage, a safe credential storage, which is called a credhub. So the CLI will communicate with that credential storage and it's gonna save it, which we're gonna cover later on, the credhub integration with BOSH itself. So this covers till now all those commands here, everything. Before I go into the state.json, so that's the last thing we're gonna touch base here, let's actually see what is the structure of the actual manifest that will be given to the create-env command after all this patching and all this creds generation. What's the state, what is the structure of the actual manifest that will be given to the create-env command, so that it will be able to generate the VM, to create the BOSH VM. And to do that, there's a command that we can use, and it's called BOSH interpolate. Think about BOSH interpolate as a subset of create-env. So BOSH interpolate will patch those files and it will generate the variables, and it will spit out a YAML file for us to see. So for BOSH interpolate, we don't need the state, and there's an alias for BOSH interpolate. It's called int. So let's go and run it, redirect it to a file, and see what is the structure of the actual manifest that would be used by create-env just before it start create the VM. So I already actually did that, but let me actually, so I'm just running it and I'm piping the result to manifest.yaml. So let's go here and we can see the manifest.yaml. This is the actual manifest, the YAML manifest that will be given to the create VM so that it will know how to create the director VM. We will not go into the details what's going on here. It will be it will complicate things very quickly at this stage, but it's worth to mention that you can see those credentials here. Those are technically the variables that were generated. The only thing is that we will not see them here is this manifest.yaml will be generated in memory, will be patched and created in memory, and it will be used by create-env. So it will not use it. It will not create it and persist it on your file system. So this till now, so this one covers what the BOSH create VM does. So let's actually come back to this one and go back to create VM. So the last thing we want to talk about is the state, the dash state. What does the state mean here? So just a small recap. What do we have so far? The create VM command, it's taking the base YAML file, it's adding few items to it using the operations file, and then it's generating some variables. And after it's generating some variables, it's taking some variables that the user is providing themselves. It will inject it to the to this in-memory YAML file, and which is this one, but we just actually created that ourselves. But in create-env flow, it's going to be in memory, and whenever it does that, and it has that manifest.yaml file ready, it will start to communicate with the IS to create the VM. So whenever it will start to create the VM, we're gonna go through each of the steps that the output of the create-env command later on. But let's say it finished, it will populate the state.json file. What is the state.json file? It's a file that will be created wherever you like, wherever you have specified. So let's go and see what is it. A small, maybe explanation, a quick explanation. What does it have? It contains the state of the VM, some metadata about the VM or disks or IaaS related specific properties that are related to the BOSH director VM that you have created. So for example, we have the director ID, the process that is running on that VM, it has an ID. It has a stem cell ID. We're gonna talk about it in the next video. Why do we have a stem cell ID here? Let's say we have the disk. We know what is the disk ID that is attached to the BOSH VM. We also have like the VM ID, the actual VM ID, the IaaS ID of the actual BOSH VM. In this scenario, it's going to be the VirtualBox VM, and some other stuff here. So this is a very important file. Why? Because later on, after we create the director, after some point, if we need to do some modifications, let's say you want to increase the size of the disk, or you want to bump up the size of the VM, you will need this file so that create-env can know that it has created this before, and then it's gonna contact the VM. It's gonna try to migrate the data of the disks and some other operations. So it's very important to keep the state.json file stored somewhere until you safely delete your environment. So if we go back to the agenda, so we talked about the operations files and the BOSH interpolate, and what this command mean in general. In the next video, we're gonna look at the actual output of the BOSH create-env command, create-env command, and we're gonna go through line by line what does it mean and why it's important. I think personally it's important to know what's happening as a BOSH operator, to know what's going on here. So I'll see you in the next video.